Welcome, appreciate you all coming. I'm Dan Wire. I'm the head of our crisis communications practice here at Mandiant, joined by Jen Burnside.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be with you today and talking again about preparing for the whole attack.
So quick background, the crisis communications practice at Mandiant is relatively new. We were formed about 3 years ago, and it was based off of how threat actors are operating today, and as they're extending beyond traditionally technical measures, how can we help our clients prepare for that? And so just kind of running through what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about the totality of what an attack is and what we see on the front lines, how CISOs are particularly challenged right now. We'll run through some quasi-theoretical use cases and some of the challenges that our clients encounter during those. We'll talk about some ways that the CISO can be a business enabler and kind of transition to helping manage organizational risk. What can we actually do to make things better, and how organizational planning, exciting things like governance comes into play for that. And then we'll absolutely want this to be bi-directional. And so as you do have questions, please, we'll have a little bit of a session at the end. Preparing for the whole attack. We have seen threat actors evolve, and how they execute their attacks, they are looking broadly at organizational risk. So traditionally, we have thought of cyber attacks as a very technical process. And I think if we step back about 10 years and we zoomed in on something specifically like ransomware, it was fundamentally technical. We'd have a threat actor break in, they would deploy ransomware in an environment, take down, and they would extort based off of restoration of services. What we've seen is that's evolved. And so if you all are Mandiant familiar, you've probably seen this lifecycle attack. It's been around for about 10 years, and it is a very good description of how threat actors, from a technical perspective, enter an environment and execute their attack. I'll put a little promotion out if you didn't get a chance to catch Jabran's talk yesterday on ransomware. He went very much into details here. Once that data is exfiltrated, there's a whole other life cycle that takes place. And so this is really where we start to get involved. You have data exfil. All of a sudden, the threat actor is now has options on what they're gonna extort on. You have potentially ransomware that's taking down your environment, so pay me and I'll get your environment back up and going. Or I have your data, pay me and I'll delete it. And so now they have multiple options. We've seen this with, they're looking at executing a business-oriented attack. And so they're not gonna start with dropping out the data right off the bat. What they're gonna do is start with some sort of initial outreach. That could look like a note that's left as part of the ransomware attack. It could be some targeted emails that go to an executive team. Depending on what that initial engagement is, if they're not hearing back from the victim organization, they're gonna start to escalate. And so that could be with, hey, I'm gonna start to email more individuals within that organization. I'm gonna send it to info@victimorg.com. And it's gonna say something along the lines of, we have control of your environment, we've taken your data, please click on this link and let's start talking. Once we get that kind of engagement going, there's the potential for public awareness, and that's gonna continue to escalate the risk. This can come in a variety of different techniques. So assuming that maybe we haven't started any sort of negotiation, they're gonna put out, this company has been the victim of a ransomware attack. I have all their data on a dark web name and shame site. Pretty typical escalation. They might actually go out and start some direct media contact. And we've seen varying degrees of that over the years. I think some reporters are more willing to engage with threat actors than others. But the threat actors understand the dynamic of how the media operate in this process, and they're gonna use that to increase risk to the organization. Again, depending on how things are unfolding, there's gonna be some potential for extended public disclosure. What could that be? Moving into a public social network, an X or Reddit, or something where they're actually saying now to a broader set of people, I have this victim organization's data, and you should be worried about that. We've also seen direct stakeholder engagement. And so they'll go through their exfiltrated data. They'll say, I identified these contacts. I'm going to reach out to these contacts and say, I got your data from this company. You should be worried. So now those stakeholders are reaching out to the original victim organization saying, why is this malicious person contacting me? All of these actions are in the interest of getting paid, right? And so if we're thinking about a ransomware extortion incident, they are trying to accomplish their mission. If they get paid along the way, it potentially could stop these actions from happening, and that's what they're relying on. What they want to try and do is push the victim organization to the point that they feel like the risk of public disclosure is greater than the risk of paying the extortion. And so all of this becomes just a way to increase risk within that, to that victim organization. This can go on and it can repeat. There will be a certain point, depending on how you've engaged with the threat actor, when they might give up, and they very possibly could give up and go away, or they very possibly could give up and make it as messy as possible. And unfortunately, we don't know what they're gonna do for the most part, so we have to generally assume the worst. So that kind of takes us through that extended life cycle.
So when it comes to the CISO, right, the CISO is really the bridge to bring the two teams from the technical side and the non-technical side together. One of the biggest changes we've seen in the last 3 decades is the CISO went from a traditional, building of technical infrastructure, monitoring of alerts, to really focused on interpreting what is the risk and being that linchpin and collaborator to bring those two teams together. So not only could we prepare and plan and build some resiliency, but also ask the right questions. One of the big things that the attacker had from the attacker's advantage was before they had a bigger distance between the security operations center and the board or the leadership team. CISOs have worked to close that gap as well. And so those have helped build some of the knowledge and expertise within the organization. So one of the big things is you can think of today's CISO, right? 3 decades ago, we didn't have GRC programs under the CISO, right? Governance, risk, and compliance. The first thing I think about when I think about GRC is not only about the security team, but what about our legal team? How are we collaborating? Thinking about the actual business units. Are they telling us what their crown jewels are? Are they telling us what are those key data sets or business processes that we can't afford to fail? And as a team, working through and planning for those type of responses. So now we're going to go through a couple use cases, and we're really going to want to have you thinking about 5 specific areas of risk. The business risk to the organization, right? If you have to shut down an assembly line, what does that mean? Who makes those calls? Who informs the risk? Think about all the players in your organizations. Who would you be including in that discussion? When it comes to the technical controls, right? Is this only a CISO discussion? How far up the chain and down the chain and across does this discussion go? You should be including your product line representatives because they're going to know best and be able to help inform the decision. Now, legal. This is a constantly evolving space. Knowing what is going on here in the US is one thing. If you're a global organization trying to think about all of the other layers of legal and regulatory matters that come into play, thinking about those contract sides when it comes to, what are your SLAs that are in your contracts when you have to inform an organization that you may be impacted by a vulnerability or have an incident yourself or be victim of an incident, right? There are a lot of legal and regulatory pieces that come in. And obviously the financial, right? It's not just that direct financial from the procurement of hardware or replacement systems that need to be acquired, but also that non-direct financial risk to brand and reputation. And that's our last one, right? Reputation. It is very hard to quantify the reputational impact to an organization. And for those people, it's usually your comms and your marketing that are thinking about that. It may also be your investor relations. So you see all of the different groups and organizations that I'm bringing into the discussion. And as today's modern CISO or IT security specialist, you should be doing the same. So we're going to walk through 2 specific use cases.
So we'll talk first kind of about the whole of organization response. And here's our quasi-theoretical situation. A manufacturing company has been hit with ransomware. Servers are encrypted, backups have been compromised, production is impacted, the entire supply chain's been disrupted. You're going to have contractual obligations that are missed as part of this. Public company, the stock price is impacted. The decryption key's been used successfully by other victim orgs, so you know there's an answer out there potentially. And the client is asking for a rapid return to business. Some of the really challenging things that we run into are a misunderstanding by the rest of the organization of how a technical ransom incident unfolds and the impact that the role that they'll play as part of this. One thing that gets a lot of organizations tripped up is the engage or not engage question with the threat actor. So I'm going to do a little bit of a poll. Has anybody actually been through an active ransom incident? Decent number of people. Again, hands up, did you engage with the threat actor? So 70%. Did you end up paying? No. That's one of the okay, so we might have had one. That's one of the misunderstandings that I think we run into a lot, is that organizations assume if they engage with the threat actor that they're going to have to pay. Engaging with the threat actor actually can be very valuable. There's some downsides too, but you're going to end up getting, first of all, a dialogue. And so we can go back to that escalation wheel, and we can potentially disrupt the escalation, because what the threat actor is looking for is some sort of engagement. They want to get paid. And so if they're talking to the people that are going to potentially pay them, they don't have to keep escalating to get noticed. So that's a benefit of that. The other thing that you can get is some intel about what information they got, potentially how they got into the system. And also, you can gather some information about kind of timing, what they're thinking. They'll start to extend deadlines, or they'll accelerate deadlines. But it will be less, you'll gain more data points in your overall response and how it's going to unfold. That's the first takeaway. Helping your executive teams in particular understand that engaging with the threat actor doesn't necessarily mean paying. Now, the second one, my favorite thing, we do a ton of tabletops. And just about every executive leader throws a fist down, declares, we'll never pay a ransom. And then you go into live events, and all of a sudden the calculus is completely changed. And your systems are down. They've claimed to have taken all of your most valuable data. It's going to be weeks before you're back up. And payment becomes a really valid consideration at that point. You have to think about the health of your business. Mandiant does not advise one way or the other. We don't have a recommendation there. But as you're thinking about how you would respond to a ransom event, don't just think about the technical response. Think about what are the conditions that you would pay or not pay, and trying to set up a structure. It will also help you back out where are your crown jewels, what's the most valuable thing. So you can improve some processes based on your payment discussion, but having that discussion before you get into a live event is really important. The business continuity question comes up a lot. And so these systems are down. What can you do, if anything, to provide some restoration of services? Sometimes the answer is just nothing. But can you get ahead of your inbound customer inquiries and having some sort of workaround? If it's a major manufacturer and you're just not able to produce the things you normally produce, fair enough. But a lot of times there might be backup systems that you can continue to operate or provide some sort of services. As part of thinking about this organizational risk, have conversations with your business continuity team. We went in with one manufacturer, and the CISO said, our SLA is 5 days. And the business continuity team said, we don't have any continuity plans for past 3. So let's make sure that there's some alignment on, here's our worst case scenario from a technical perspective, and then make sure that the business continuity team is aligned and understands that. And then stakeholder communications. And when we think about the first half of kind of why communications become so important is because of how threat actors are operating. The second half is we can actually use stakeholder communications as an input to what we need to be communicating to our stakeholders. And I'll pause for 1 minute. When I say stakeholders, it's the ecosystem of organizations, of individuals that are aligned with a successful recovery of this incident. Audiences are separate from that. And so I would put the media, I would put social networks, I would put random commenters on LinkedIn in the audience category. We really want to focus in on our stakeholders because they're the ones that will drive the business long term. If you can maintain some level of trust, if they can understand, yes, something bad happened, but this organization is operating with a level of trust and trying to restore things as quickly as possible, you'll have a better outcome. If you're really focused on stopping a news cycle, I have yet to see that happen. And so if you can make it happen, fantastic. But once these things kind of get going, they get going. The media is misaligned with our objectives. The media wants page views, they want clicks, they want video views. There's nothing wrong with that. They play a really important role in this whole process. But we think of them as a conduit to our stakeholders rather than letting the media drive our communications. Just kind of thinking through how this all comes together, making sure that you have all the people in the room that are going to be making these decisions, that you've established work streams. We'll talk about some best practices later. But these are the hard questions we come in, and none of these are fundamentally technical. But if any of our CISOs in the room know, everybody else turns to the CISO and says, well, what should we do? And there's a business risk evaluation that needs to happen. And the CISO may not be the right person to do that. Hopefully they can help inform the various elements of the investigation will help inform these decisions, but you also have to make a lot of decisions with very limited and imperfect information. Let's go to our next one.
So while Dan shared all of the wonderful things about ransomware, the other common type of attack that we see happening is when a threat actor exploits business processes. So think of business email compromise. Just to give you a little sense of volume, in 2024, the FBI released their Internet Crime Complaint Report and said that there were over 21,000 BEC incidents in the year of 2024 that equated to $2.77 billion. That's a big industry, billion with a B. So in this particular case, hypothetical case, the actor gains access to the CFO's email account. It could be someone in procurement, it could be someone in finance. They do recon, they sit, they wait. They try to figure out who are the important parts, what are the pre-decisional items that the threat actor could potentially weaponize, right? What type of information does the CFO or the CFO's team have access to that threat actor that they could exploit? They also learn the cadence of financial reporting. Let's say, for example, maybe a merger and acquisition is ongoing, right? So the threat actor can take that information. They can use it for their own to try and exploit the organization. That's similar to ransomware. They could take the data and try to exploit it. Second, they could try to sell it to a competitor and try to monopolize or monetize their criminal activities in that way. The third way is they could take it and start to exploit those downstream customers or accounts. So again, these are just 3 of the ways that a threat actor could possibly use and weaponize that information. They could also take it, for example, you have sensitive merger and acquisition data, they could take it and spill it out into the public, right? Let a reporter know in advance of what's happening downstream. So again, these are just a couple of ways. And if they threaten to leak it to the press or a competitor, how are you as an organization positioned to respond? What are you going to say? Have you had these conversations with your own organizations to try and, of course, pre-decide or pre-plan on what your response strategy would be? Because again, just look at the numbers of how common. So one of the big CISO blind spots, though, on this is often the case of a business email compromise. They have all the technical monitoring that's needed, right? But it produces a false negative. It doesn't necessarily alert that it's something that's really significant. They might see, for example, traditional files from the CFO's email, nothing out of the ordinary. So this is one of the things, of course, to make sure that your team is aware of, and it's that sharing that information and intelligence outside of the cybersecurity team's purview, making sure those non-technical organizational entities understand what's the threat and how they may be targeted. One of the initial vectors that we've seen, Mandiant does a report every year. In our M-Trends report that was released this past May, phishing was 14% of the cases we'd investigated. How do you think most of organizations get access to email accounts? But the phish, right? A successful phish is part of that. And with AI, those are getting to be a lot more, mimicking what would be a realistic email from your CFO. So from an executive decision point and how you can approach it, some of the things, again, similar to ransomware, like knowing where your crown jewels are, what are those essential business processes, having those conversations about who gets to decide if we have to cut a transaction off, and what are those ramifications. Is that at the cybersecurity level, or would that have to come from the CFO? Now, obviously, this is one of those type of events. You're going to want to make sure you've already got your law enforcement partners in your Rolodex, because there is a possibility that the FBI might be able to assist you, or other agencies, depending on where you're located, in potentially recovering those funds, because you are a victim company. In terms of a data governance policy, just a show of hands, how many of the organizations in the room have a data governance policy? Okay, wonderful. That's great. It's nearly 100%. So, the point about it is, I can remember those days where no one wanted to delete emails, no one wanted to delete information. The wanting to hold information can actually be one of the biggest vulnerabilities for the organization. If you have an attack and the person who was victimized, let's say that same CFO, if they had 7 or 8 years of email and the threat actor takes it all, there's a lot of information that threat actor can, like I said, weaponize. So these are some of the things to think about. The other piece that we see all too common is that supplier-vendor integration, right? Your supplier upstream or downstream has an incident. Are you going to make that decision to sever, and vice versa? When they decide to sever from you, sever an API integration, how is that going to impact you? Think about that resiliency and redundancy, and what processes manually could you maybe switch to. And then the last one. Who are the lawyers in the room? Can you raise your hands? These are the friends that you want to have. And I'll say this because when I was in government, I always wanted to have a lawyer's advice and their counsel, and understanding what are my risks. They help inform the CISO and the cybersecurity team and tell what's your left and your right. The other part is the comms people, right? And making sure the comms and the operation are really articulating what is the actual impact. So again, by knowing what to expect in a business email compromise, and for your team knowing when to respond, it's better for them to raise their hand and say, I think we have a problem, than to try and fix it on their own. Like I said, there are possible ways to recover these funds. So this is just, again, one of the second use case risk studies that we wanted to share with you today.
I'm going to talk about some landmines. And I think overwhelmingly we come in and we work with clients who have the best of intentions. And perhaps one of the first things we see is we want to be completely transparent through this. That is not a best practice. And the reason being, most of the time, is that there's a lot of details that unfold over the course of investigation, and those details will change. We do not want communications to get ahead of what we know for sure coming out of the investigation. And there's really two impacts of that. One is, as we're going through this, we want to be viewed as the source of truth for this incident. And especially if it's a high-profile incident, there's a lot of people looking for updates. we want known good information to come from the victim organization, and we want to have confidence in that. If we're constantly updating that information, it undermines that confidence. Oh, well, it wasn't this many records, it was that times 3. Ultimately, a lot of the details are pretty irrelevant to your impacted stakeholders. Everybody asks, but that doesn't mean that you have to share them. We want to be focused on what we call measured transparency as we go through these incidents. And then the other thing that happens is if you're constantly updating your information and kind of revising it, you're keeping a news cycle going. And so we want to be out of the news cycle. We want to be very boring for the most part. And if we're interesting, if we're saying, oh, actually it's getting worse, that just keeps us in the news cycle. That's definitely suboptimal. We don't want to disregard stakeholder risk. And my little graphic for that is circling the wagons, right? I'll share from our FireEye breach back in 2020 when we were compromised via SolarWinds. One of the things that we took away from that is FireEye had investigated to a certain point, and we had an idea of who the threat actor was, but we didn't have high confidence attribution yet. But we did find out that the threat actor had gotten to our red teaming tools, which as a security company, it's very humbling to be the focus of a threat actor and to have been breached. But our leadership team, and Kevin Mandiant really drove this, he said, we are a security company, we're here to make this community more secure. We're not gonna let anything happen that undermines that. So even though the threat of the red teaming tools was pretty low, they could have been used against certainly our customers, but the community at large. So we wrote mitigations for every one of our red teaming tools. I think our red teamers were crying as they did it. And then we released those and we said, this is what happened. As the incident continued to unfold, we found out that it was the Russian government, that they had a much wider impact than just FireEye. It proved to our community that we were going to operate with trust and we were going to look out for everybody's risk through this process. It's one of the lessons that we take forward as we guide clients to make sure you're thinking about your stakeholders' risk, because that will continue the trust. Something bad happened, you can't undo that, but you can operate with a way that shows that you're considering everybody's trust. And then the misaligned internal response. And that can happen certainly from a communications perspective. We worked one case where the communications didn't make it to the sales team, and the sales field, bless their hearts, are the most generous people with information, whether or not it's true. And so one of their sales people had shared with a customer that it was a ransom event, their systems were down, but we'll be back up on Wednesday. Without any context behind it, without any truth. That went through the customer's email systems, and then it made out into the public. It made it into a Reddit post because it was a fairly high-profile event. And then it was public information that actually misaligned with what they had filed in their 8K and was being discussed as though it was truth. We got to make sure when we're communicating with all of our stakeholders, internal and external, and we have one consistent message. But then also working the incident. And so we kind of talked earlier about, hey, let's make sure that the business continuity team is aligned with what the expectations are from the investigation so that they can understand that. Put all those pieces together. Make sure that you have a governance structure that's bringing the right folks into the room so that they can understand what how the incident's unfolding and how they're going to respond.
So the CISO as a business enabler, essentially they're going to lead that planning and response. You're going to bring all the different parties together. You're also going to identify those gaps in those cross-functional teams. And probably the best way to do that, to believe it or not, is to conduct a tabletop exercise and make sure not only your internal key responders are there, but also your third-party ecosystem, because they're going to feed in and say, well, maybe that's not the way I would advise you as your legal counsel. Or from a comm standpoint, I would actually want to get with this reporter first and walk them back from the story. The other piece is understanding and translating that technical risk to business risk. It's probably the hardest learning curve for new CISOs to get into. But once they're in, they really lock on and they can definitely inform and educate their peers on what those risks are. And then the last piece is, again, those simulations, not just in tabletop exercises, but even just small one-offs, and not just focused on your primary responders, but your secondary and your tertiary. Because one thing I can assure you is the threat actor doesn't just maintain 9 to 5 hours and take off holidays and weekends, right? They're going to hit you when you least expect it. When you had your trip of a lifetime planned, right? I can't tell you, probably many of you in this room can understand and relate to, events or opportunities that you've had to change the course on. So again, that CISO is that business enabler, bringing in all of those various representatives and helping not only to test, but also to, based off of the results of those tests, build and revise your playbooks and plans. So you've figured it out, right? You're leading the crisis communication planning for your organization. It started, as Dan said, with your stakeholders. You've mapped it out. You figured out who are those internal audiences, those external audiences. How are you going to communicate with them? What channels are you going to use? You've figured out the sequence. That's very important. Now, the threat actor may take out your primary channel, right? So you also have to, that's the key point about redundancy. Do some red cell analysis. Think about, if I take out your corporate email, what are you going to pivot to? If I take out your customer portal, how are you going to get messages to your customer portal? We were working with a client, and one of the things that they had was they weren't quite sure how to get to their downstream clients, but they did have invoicing and billing, right? So starting to look and think creative when you're on the hook, right? And when it comes to making those critical decisions, you're going to have to make them under pressure, but let's give yourself a little bit of breathing room by starting to think about them in advance. How you're going to communicate, like I said, that redundancy in channels. When you're going to communicate, that sequence. If you haven't mapped that out in advance and your board is expecting to be notified before or there's a specific high-touch client that you want to get to, know who those clients are, those customers are, have their phone numbers, have their cell phone numbers if you can, right? Make sure you know the same for your vendors, right? What are those alternate ways to get in touch with your vendors? Because to be honest, if you reached out to them in a Gmail and you haven't been using Gmail before, they might think you're a threat actor, right? It makes sense. So at least establishing with them the fact that, hey, I will reach out to you and this is how I'm going to reach out to you from a redundancy standpoint. And then the what. You can build templates, but the templates are just the starting point. You have to customize it to the event. You have to think about what actionable information are you sharing with the customer, or what step do you want them to take? And then as part of that, what's your feedback loop, right? So these are some of the ways from a planning perspective that you can think about. So I'm going to give you 5 more essential elements. So from an essential element, start with the foundation. It's just like building a house. So when I work with a new client who doesn't have a crisis communications playbook or a plan, I say, can I see all your documentation through discovery? First thing I'm looking for is their governance chart. If they don't have it, I'm taking their org chart and then helping them to figure out, who are those key executives that are going to be part of your executive steering committee and going to take on some of those sensitive discussions that Dan talked about during the ransomware use case example, right? The pay, not pay, the engage, not pay, engage, not engage. Then from the next level down, that executive leadership team that's going to serve as my crisis management team. Making sure that you've got representatives not only across your different business units, but globally. If you're a global organization, you're thinking about who do you need to involve from each of the regions, from EMEA, APJ, North Am, etc. Second, building capability and framework. We've hit this a couple of times, but you need to understand your response team, know how to get in touch with that primary, secondary, tertiary. I've got the cell phones. They know how I'm going to reach them. It may be that if you don't already have an out-of-band, this is going to be probably one of the areas where you start and focus on. You have governance. If you don't already have your capability and framework for getting those responders activated, this will be one place for you to start. The second area we've talked about, crown jewels and data. Mapping that out, understanding, making sure you're on the same page with your different business units across the organization. And then that partnership in those ecosystems, understanding where you're integrated. And so those are part of the key elements that we think about. Thirdly, defining those roles and responsibilities. We go through a RACI matrix exercise with organizations, and literally we follow along the path of what would happen during an incident and an investigation. So nefarious activity, how does SecOps respond, who are they notifying, how are, once the severity is determined, how are they escalating it, everybody knowing and being on the same point from a severity standpoint on when that activation is going to occur. So when you hear the sound and the alarm, you know what to respond. We think about it from a responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed standpoint. So responsible, who's going to have the action to do? Accountable, who is going to have the oversight and the ultimate belly button responsibility when the action takes place? Consulted, who do they need to be informed? Just working with a client today, their discretionary list on consulted is probably longer than their actual regular consulted, but they wanted to make sure, treat it like a pilot's checklist. They can go through and make sure it's repeatable and going through and bringing in those different parties. And then informed. Who do the outputs or actions need to be apprised with? The fourth part, we've talked to focus on stakeholders, internal and external audiences, mapping them to channels, making sure we've thought about that redundancy from a standpoint if the threat actor especially impacts our comms. And then lastly, that risk-based communication, the when, the what, the fact that Dan talked about, the owning the narrative. If I don't fill that void, threat actors will fill it, competitors will fill it, and people will often say misinformation. So I want to own the narrative. I want to be the single source of truth on my incidents. And there's going to be a period, unfortunately, when we say this a lot of times to clients, right? We have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. There will be a period where we might not be able to say anything. And that's probably the hardest thing to tell your CEO. I'm sorry, we can't say anything. And say, well, but we're doing these steps. Let's at least tell them the steps. But there might be a reason not to. What you say could also tip your hand to the threat actor. So we're very conscious when it comes to comms and when it comes to our crisis response. We're very purposeful in what we do.
And I'd also offer, we are crafting what's going to become a legally defensive narrative through this. And so obviously we're working very closely with our legal partners, but to Jen's point, a lot of times clients will come in and say, can't we just list everything we've said and publish it? That's not always the right approach because you're putting out a list of things that you potentially weren't doing before. And so working very closely with your legal team to make sure we're aligned with our legal approach. As we wrap up here, just some key takeaways. Fundamentally, do not assume the rest of your organization is prepared. I think we run into two drastic use cases. One is the rest of the organization is really not prepared, or they're relying on an all scenarios crisis response plan that doesn't really fit a cyber event. And so they're going to drop back into some kind of well-worn paths that don't actually work for cyber. So that can make the situation worse. Go have lunch with your comms and legal heads. If you're on the technical side, I am encouraging you, go have lunch with them. Make sure that they understand that they know what they're gonna go through during a cyber event and figure out if they're prepared. And then also on the legal side, I will, on behalf of every legal colleague that we've had, make sure that you have a legal firm that specializes in cyber events and you've pre-identified them prior to going in. Same as your Mandiant incident response retainer. Make sure you have an equivalency on your legal retainer. This is a relationship. They want to know what are your risk tolerances. They want to get in. They want to understand contractual things. If you can get that all set up prior to actually going through an event and get to know one another, you have a much better experience with your legal team who's assisting you with that. Up-level the cyber understanding to your organization. If after those lunches you don't feel like the rest of the organization really understands, try and get them some training. Try and get them to think through what's going to happen if our primary email communication system goes down for employees? What about our primary marketing system to send emails to customers? What happens if those goes down? Start to think through, how do you respond when the normal systems aren't there? That's a really good place to start. And then test. A whole of organization or an executive tabletop is really important so that people can see how the incident unfolds. You can identify some gaps along the way, we always do, and make sure that people have an understanding of this is a modern cyber attack. It impacts risk across the organization. And then understanding data and using that to guide risk assessments. What data flows through your organization and what data is impacted will drive so much of the communications. We start with legal, regulatory, contractual requirements. That's what drives communications right off the bat. And so if you have regulated data within your environment, you want to know right away if that's been impacted. It takes some time, and actually you won't know that right away. You might know if a system that holds that has been impacted, but you won't necessarily know what went out the door right away. But use that to structure your overall response, and then also that'll have a big impact on communications.